The heat was oppressive that Tuesday morning in August, the kind that made the air shimmer above the cracked earth and turned every breath into work. The construction site sat 3 miles outside the chain-link perimeter of what used to be Coldwater Air Force Base, decommissioned in 1989 and left to rust under the Nevada sun. The government had finally sold the surrounding land for development. A new industrial park, they said. Good for the local economy. Good for jobs. Marcus Webb didn't care much about the economics. He cared about finishing this grading job on schedule, so his crew could move on to the next site. At 47, he'd been running construction teams for 2 decades, and he'd learned that government contracts came with their own peculiar headaches. Delays meant penalties. Penalties meant lost profit. Lost profit meant angry phone calls from the company owner. So when the excavator's bucket hit something solid at 9:47 a.m., Marcus's first thought wasn't curiosity. It was frustration. "Hold up!" shouted Danny Reeves from the edge of the trench. He was 23, fresh out of trade school, still eager enough to get excited about complications. "There's something down there." Marcus climbed down from the site trailer, wiping sweat from his forehead with a red bandana. The sun was already brutal, and it wasn't even 10 o'clock. He walked over to where Danny stood with Tommy Vickers and Ray Castellano, all 3 of them peering into the shallow excavation like kids who'd found a treasure chest. "What did you hit?" Marcus asked. "Metal," said Tommy, the excavator operator. He was in his 50s, heavy set, with tattoos running up both arms from his days in the Marines. "Big piece of metal. Not rebar, not a pipe. Something else." Marcus jumped down into the trench. The exposed edge of whatever they'd hit gleamed dully in the sunlight. Steel, from the look of it. Thick and corroded, but still solid. He kicked at the dirt around it, revealing more of the surface. It was flat, regular, manufactured. Probably an old fuel tank, Marcus said, or a septic system from the base. "Out here?" Danny asked. "We're miles from the main facilities." "Military does weird things," Ray said. He was the oldest of the crew at 61, a quiet man who'd worked construction since Vietnam. "Bury everything. Fuel, waste, classified papers. Easier than hauling it off." Marcus ran his hand along the exposed metal. It was cool to the touch despite the heat, and the surface had a texture that felt wrong. Not quite smooth, but not quite rough either. Industrial. Purpose-built. He straightened up and pulled out his radio. "Base, this is Webb at Site 7. Static crackled, then a voice responded. "Go ahead, Webb. We've got an obstruction in the primary excavation. Looks like buried infrastructure, possibly military. Need guidance on how to proceed." There was a long pause. Marcus could picture Jerry Holcomb, the project manager, sitting in his air-conditioned office 30 miles away, already annoyed at the delay. "What kind of obstruction?" "Steel. Large. Can't tell dimensions yet." Another pause. "Is it blocking the build footprint?" Marcus looked at the survey stakes, marking where the foundation would go. The metal object, whatever it was, sat about 20 feet outside the primary zone. "Negative. It's off to the west side." "Then work around it. We're on a tight schedule, Marcus. Document it, flag it, and stay on task. We'll report it to the base historical liaison when we file the weekly update." Marcus felt a flicker of irritation. "Copy that." He clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at his crew. "You heard the man. Tag it, photograph it, and let's get back to work. Danny, get some stakes and caution tape. I want it marked so nobody drives over it." "Shouldn't we at least see what it is?" Danny asked. "Not our problem," Marcus said. "We're here to grade and pour foundations, not dig up old junk. Let the historical people deal with it." Tommy nodded and climbed back into the excavator. Ray returned to the concrete mixer, but Danny lingered, staring down at the metal surface. "Doesn't it make you curious?" he asked. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "Curiosity costs money, kid. Flag it and move on." They worked through the rest of the morning without incident. The excavator carved away at the earth, the mixer churned, and the August sun beat down on them like a punishment. By noon, they broke for lunch in the shade of the site trailer, eating sandwiches and drinking warm Gatorade from a cooler that had long since lost its ice. "I looked it up," Danny said, staring at his phone. Coldwater AFB was involved in experimental aircraft testing in the 60s and 70s. Prototypes, high-altitude reconnaissance, that kind of thing. "So," Tommy said around a mouthful of turkey sandwich, "so maybe that thing we found is related, like a bunker or a storage facility." Ray snorted. "Or it's a diesel tank. You're overthinking it." "I'm just saying, there's history here. Classified history." Marcus listened without commenting. He'd worked enough government jobs to know that military bases were littered with forgotten infrastructure. Fuel depots, communication cables, sewage systems, ammunition bunkers, all of it buried and abandoned when budgets dried up or missions changed. 9 times out of 10, it was harmless. Boring even. But there was something about the metal they'd uncovered that bothered him. The way it had felt under his hand. The way it sat in the ground, perfectly level, as if it had been placed rather than buried. "After lunch, I want to expose a little more of it," Marcus said. "Just enough to see what we're dealing with. Take some better photos for the report." Danny's face lit up. "Seriously, don't get excited. We're just documenting. Half an hour, then we're back on schedule." By 1:30, they had cleared enough dirt to reveal the full outline of the object. It wasn't a fuel tank. It wasn't a septic system. It was a container, rectangular, approximately 30 feet long and 12 feet wide, made of reinforced steel that had oxidized to a deep reddish-brown. The top surface was flat and featureless except for a series of heavy bolts running along the seams and a faded emblem near one end. Danny crouched down and brushed away the remaining dirt from the emblem with his gloved hand. Beneath the rust and grime, stenciled letters emerged. U.S. Department of Defense, Biohazard Division, 1962. Below that, a symbol, a triangle containing 3 interlocking circles. A radiation warning? No, something else. Something medical. "Jesus," Tommy muttered. "That's a biohazard marker." Ray stepped back from the edge of the trench. "We need to call this in. Right now." Marcus felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He pulled out his radio again. "Base, this is Webb. We've got a situation." "Go ahead." "The buried object is a sealed military container marked with biohazard warnings. Date stamp says 1962. We need environmental services out here before we proceed." This time, the pause was even longer. When Jerry's voice came back, it sounded strained. "Stand by." They stood by. 5 minutes passed. 10. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky, and the wind picked up, carrying dust across the site in lazy spirals. Finally, the radio crackled. "Webb, this is Holcomb. I've contacted the regional office. They're reaching out to the EPA and the base closure office. In the meantime, secure the site and cease all excavation in that area. Do not attempt to open or move the container." "Copy that. What's our timeline for resumption?" "Unknown. Could be days. Could be weeks." Marcus swore under his breath. Weeks would kill their schedule. Kill their budget. Understood. He turned to his crew. "All right, you heard it. We're off that area until further notice. Let's focus on the eastern section. We can still get the utility trenches dug while we wait for clearance." But none of them moved. They all stood there, staring at the container, at the faded warnings, at the heavy bolts that sealed it shut. "What do you think is in there?" Danny asked quietly. "Nothing," Ray said. "Nothing anymore. Whatever it was, it's been sealed up for 60 years. "Then why bury it?" Tommy asked. "Why not just decontaminate it and scrap it?" No one had an answer. That night, Marcus stayed late to finish paperwork. The crew had gone home at 5. But he'd lingered, telling himself it was to update the daily logs, to photograph the container from multiple angles for the report, to make sure everything was properly documented. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. He couldn't stop thinking about it. He stood at the edge of the excavation as the sun set, casting long shadows across the site. The container looked different in the failing light, darker, more solid, more present. The wind had picked up, blowing hard out of the west, and as it swept across the exposed metal, Marcus heard something. A sound, low and steady, almost inaudible beneath the wind. A hum, maybe, or a vibration. He crouched down, pressing his ear close to the surface. There, definitely there. A faint resonance, like the container itself was vibrating at some frequency just below normal hearing. It reminded him of standing near high-voltage power lines, that electric sensation that made your teeth ache. He stood quickly, suddenly aware of how alone he was. The nearest building was 3 miles away. The highway was a thin line in the distance. Above, the first stars were appearing in a sky going from blue to purple to black. Marcus walked back to his truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. Danny Reeves couldn't sleep. He lay in his studio apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the container. He'd spent hours researching after he got home, falling down rabbit holes on obscure military history forums and declassified document databases. Coldwater Air Force Base had been more than just an aircraft testing facility. Between 1959 and 1967, it had housed a classified research program codenamed Project Redline. The details were sparse. Most documents were still redacted, but the fragments Danny found painted a disturbing picture. Biological experimentation, extreme environment survival, human endurance thresholds. One partially declassified memo from 1963 mentioned containment protocols and subject termination and deep burial contingencies. Danny sat up, reaching for his phone. He pulled up the photos he'd taken of the container, zooming in on the emblem, the date, the warning symbols. Biohazard Division, 1962. Right in the middle of Project Redline's operational window. His phone buzzed. A text from Tommy. You up? Asterisk yeah. Can't stop thinking about it. Asterisk. Asterisk same. Ray too. He called me an hour ago. Said he's got a bad feeling. Asterisk. What kind of bad feeling? Asterisk the kind that comes from experience. He said he's seen stuff like this before. In Vietnam. Buried chemical weapons. Places they told you never to dig. Asterisk. Danny felt a chill despite the warmth of his apartment. You think it's chemical weapons? Asterisk I don't know what I think. But I don't like it. Asterisk. Neither did Danny. He set his phone down and tried to sleep. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw that container, sealed and silent in the dark earth, humming its barely audible song. Wednesday morning came with clouds, the first break from clear skies they'd had in 2 weeks. Marcus arrived at the site at 7 to find Ray already there, standing at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed. Morning, Marcus said. Ray nodded but didn't turn around. It's still humming. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. You can hear it. If you listen close. Tried to tell myself it was the wind, but the wind's not blowing right now. Marcus walked over and crouched down. Ray was right. The sound was still there, faint but constant. A low vibration that seemed to come from inside the container itself. Maybe it's machinery, Marcus said, not quite believing it. Old climate control or something. Running on residual power. For 60 years? Nuclear battery? They used them for remote monitoring equipment. Ray finally looked at him. You don't believe that any more than I do. Before Marcus could respond, Tommy's truck pulled up, followed by Danny's sedan. The younger man practically jumped out of his car, phone in hand. I found something, Danny said, jogging over. Listen to this. He pulled up a scanned document on his screen, a newspaper article from the Las Vegas Sun, dated September 1962. Air Force denies accident at Coldwater Base. Local residents reported seeing unusual military activity and hearing explosions near Coldwater Air Force Base last week. Base officials deny any incident occurred, stating that the increased personnel and equipment movement was part of a scheduled training exercise. When asked about reports of civilians being turned away from nearby roads, a spokesperson said the temporary closures were for routine security reasons. September 1962. Danny said. Same year as the date on the container. Tommy whistled low. So something did happen. Or didn't, Ray said. Military denies things whether they're true or not. Standard procedure. But what if, Danny started. What if nothing? Marcus interrupted. He could feel the situation spiraling. Could see the crew getting caught up in speculation and conspiracy. We follow protocol. We document. We wait for the EPA. That's it. Come on, Marcus, Danny said. Aren't you even a little curious? Curious doesn't pay the bills. We've got work to do on the east side. Let's focus on that. But even as he said it, Marcus found himself glancing back at the container, at that faded emblem, at the sealed bolts that had held for 6 decades. What were they keeping in? He wondered. Or what were they keeping out? They worked through the morning, digging utility trenches and running conduit. But the atmosphere had changed. Everyone was distracted, tense. Conversations were brief and distracted. The excavator seemed too loud, the smell of diesel too sharp. At lunch, they ate in silence. It was Tommy who finally spoke. I think we should open it. Ray looked up sharply. Absolutely not. Hear me out, Tommy said. We're sitting on a potential hazard. Biological, chemical, maybe radioactive. Every day we wait is another day of exposure. What if that seal is compromised? What if whatever's inside is leaking? Then opening it would make it worse, Ray said. Or it would let us know what we're dealing with. Look, the EPA could take weeks to respond. Maybe months, knowing government bureaucracy. In the meantime, we're working 50 yards away from something that could be contaminating the entire site. Marcus shook his head. Jerry said not to touch it. Jerry's sitting in an office 30 miles away, Tommy said. We're the ones breathing this air. Danny spoke up quietly. He's right, Marcus. What if there is something leaking? Don't we have a responsibility to know? Our responsibility is to follow protocol, Marcus said firmly. We wait for the professionals. But even as he said it, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, what if they're right? That afternoon, while Marcus was in the trailer filing reports, Tommy made a decision. He walked over to the storage container where they kept the cutting equipment, torches, grinders, welding gear. He selected a portable oxyacetylene torch and a cutting wheel for the angle grinder, loading them into a work bin along with safety goggles and a respirator. Danny saw him and walked over. What are you doing? Checking the seals, Tommy said quietly. Just looking. Not opening anything. Marcus said. Marcus is covering his ass with paperwork. But if that thing is leaking and we didn't do anything about it, if someone gets sick, that's on us. I'm just going to take a closer look at the bolts, see if there's any sign of compromise. It was a reasonable excuse. Logical even. But Danny could see the curiosity burning behind Tommy's eyes. The same curiosity he felt himself. I'll come with you, Danny said. Ray watched them cross the site, saw the equipment they carried, and understood immediately what was about to happen. He stood, intending to stop them, but something held him back. Maybe it was curiosity, too. Maybe it was the same question that had been eating at all of them since Tuesday morning. What if? Tommy and Danny set up at the western end of the container, where the seam between the lid and the body was most visible. Up close, they could see that the bolts weren't just rusted, they were welded, sealed with what looked like a secondary application of steel that had been melted directly over the bolt heads. They really didn't want this opened, Danny said. Tommy ran his hand along the seam. He could feel that vibration more strongly here, a steady pulse that seemed to travel through the metal like a heartbeat. We're just going to test one bolt, See how solid the seal is. That's all. He ignited the cutting torch, adjusting the flame to a tight blue point. Danny stood back, respirator on, filming with his phone, documentation. He told himself, though part of him knew, he was recording this because it felt significant. The torch touched the sealed bolt. Sparks showered down, bright orange against the brown rust. The metal resisted at first, then began to soften, glowing red, then white. Tommy worked carefully, cutting in a circle around the bolt head. The smell hit them first. Even through the respirators, they could detect it, sharp, chemical, with an underlying sweetness that made Danny's eyes water. It was familiar but wrong, like medical disinfectant mixed with spoiled meat. Jesus, Tommy muttered, pulling back from the torch. You smell that? Yeah. What is it? I don't know. Formaldehyde, maybe? Something preserved. The bolt suddenly gave way with a metallic clunk, falling inward into the container. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a thin stream of air hissed out from the opening, stale, pressurized air that had been sealed inside for 60 years. The smell intensified. Danny gagged, stepping back. Tommy killed the torch, and they both moved away from the container, pulling off their respirators in the cleaner air. That's not good, Danny said, coughing. No kidding. They stood there, staring at the tiny hole they created, watching as the last of the pressurized air escaped with a long, slow hiss. When it finally stopped, silence settled over the site like a weight. We need to seal that back up, Danny said. But Tommy was already moving closer again, pulling a flashlight from his belt. Let me just look. Tommy. He pressed his face close to the hole, shining the light inside. For a long moment, he was still, and Danny heard only the wind and the distant sound of the highway. Then Tommy jerked back, stumbling, his face pale. What? Danny asked. What did you see? Tommy didn't answer. He just stared at the container, his hand trembling as he lowered the flashlight. Tommy, what's in there? When Tommy finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. We need to call someone. Right now. Marcus was furious. You did what? He shouted, standing over the hole they'd created. I specifically told you not to touch this thing. We had to know, Tommy said, but he sounded shaken, uncertain. We had to. You had to follow orders. Marcus grabbed his radio. Base, this is Webb. We have a situation. Someone breached the container. Repeat, the seal is compromised. Jerry's voice came back immediately, tight with panic. What? Who authorized that? No one authorized it. It was unauthorized. But it's done. What's our protocol? Stand by. Marcus turned to his crew. Ray stood apart, his expression unreadable. Danny looked sick. Tommy was still pale, still staring at the container, like it might come alive. What did you see in there? Marcus demanded. Tommy swallowed hard. Equipment. Old medical equipment. Oxygen tanks. Glass canisters sealed. And he trailed off. And what? A chamber. Like a pressure chamber or an isolation pod. With a window. Marcus felt his blood run cold. What kind of chamber? The kind you put a person in. The radio crackled. Webb, this is Holcomb. Listen carefully. I've contacted military liaison. They're sending a team immediately. Estimated arrival 4 hours. In the meantime, you need to evacuate the site. All personnel. Right now. Copy that. And Webb, don't let anyone near that container. Understand? No one. Marcus clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at his crew. You heard him. Pack up. We're leaving. What about the equipment? Danny asked. Leave it. We'll come back tomorrow. He pointed at Tommy and Danny. You too. Not another word about this to anyone. Understood? No phone calls, no social media, nothing. They nodded, but Marcus could see the fear in their eyes. Whatever Tommy had seen in that container had scared him badly. As they gathered their belongings and headed for their vehicles, Marcus walked over to the excavation one last time. He stood at the edge, looking down at the container, at the small hole they'd cut in its surface. The humming had stopped. The silence was somehow worse. Marcus drove home in a daze, his mind racing. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. Old medical equipment, a research chamber, standard Cold War paranoia made manifest in steel and rust. But he couldn't shake the look on Tommy's face, the way his voice had trembled. The kind you put a person in. He pulled into his driveway just as the sun was setting, casting his small house in amber light. His wife, Linda, met him at the door, smiling until she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Just a long day." "You look terrible. Are you feeling okay?" Marcus realized he had a headache, dull and persistent behind his eyes. "Yeah, just tired." But that night, the headache worsened. He took Tylenol, then ibuprofen, but nothing helped. Around midnight, he got a nosebleed, sudden and profuse, requiring 20 minutes of pressure to stop. Linda wanted to take him to the hospital, but he refused. "It's just stress. I'm fine." He wasn't fine. Neither was Tommy, who woke at 2 a.m. with the same symptoms, crushing headache, nosebleed, and a wave of nausea, so intense he spent an hour in the bathroom, dry heaving. Or Danny, who couldn't sleep at all, his head pounding, his mind replaying every detail of that afternoon. Or Ray, who sat in his living room with all the lights on, a headache building behind his eyes, and a growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. Thursday morning, Marcus dragged himself out of bed feeling worse than he'd ever felt in his life. The headache had evolved into something deeper, more systemic. His joints ached, his skin was sensitive to touch, and there was a persistent ringing in his ears. He called the crew. Everyone reported the same symptoms. Food poisoning.